Welcome back to U.S. history. We are at Roman numeral 2, isolation and infamy. Another way to say it is, meanwhile, back in America, because up to this point we've been focusing on Europe, but this is U.S. history, so let's get back into this. While the Allies were fighting Hitler, the U.S. seemed to be quote-unquote safe between two oceans. How would U.S. isolation have been viewed at this time by the following groups of people? The American public. I think many Americans would have thought that this is a good thing, that we're staying isolated. Yeah, it's bad going on there, but we don't want to get involved in another European war. FDR. I think he had a better understanding on how risky and dangerous Hitler truly was. He wanted to help out the Allies, but he also knew that he couldn't do so without the support of the American people. Maybe Great Britain. Well, obviously to the British, they saw America as a necessity in continuing the war and to defeat Hitler. And then, of course, Hitler, well, he wanted to keep America out of the war as long or as much as possible. How would these positions have encouraged Hitler's move to take over sections of Europe? Well, defeat Britain perhaps before they can get to U.S. support. Maybe that'd be the main idea. Roman numeral 2, isolation and infamy. Reasons for isolation. Why was America trying to stay out of this conflict? Well, number one, tradition returned the U.S. to an isolationist foreign policy. Remember, the U.S. had rejected the League of Nations. It had always had a policy of isolationism. Think of the Monroe Doctrine way back when. World War I had not made the world safe for democracy, so obviously U.S. involvement had not helped. Most Americans desired to ignore Europe's most recent of many wars. Number two, spurred by the war debt problem, which created resentment. Americans believed that they deserved the $22 billion from the loans that they had given the Allies from World War I, which had not been paid. Europe viewed these debts differently because their purchases had improved the U.S. economy, and hadn't the Europeans suffered enough from loss of life? Most former allies had also repudiated their war debts. Number three, the Great Depression kept the focus on home. Leaders in Washington were too preoccupied with economic recovery than to get involved in foreign affairs. While Americans were opposed to joining the war, most did favor the Allies. They just hoped the Allies could defeat the Axis without U.S. intervention. Letter A, nervous neutrality, changing with the times. During the 1930s, the U.S. had passed a neutrality law that prevented any weapon trading with countries that had not paid their debts off to the U.S. This didn't hurt Germany because they were able to rearm themselves, but the weak democracies were hurt because they had no way to arm themselves. When war broke out, FDR promoted a new policy to help the Allies. It was called the Neutrality Act of 1939. It allowed nations to buy weapons with a cash and carry policy. What does that mean? It meant that weapons could only be bought with cash, and the buying nation had to transport the goods themselves. This was intended to protect American lives from German attack on the seas, also to prevent any debt from going up from the Allied nations. Also during this time, many Americans favored what were called America First committees. What you need to know about the America First committees is these groups consisted of vocal isolationists and pacifists who opposed getting involved in the war effort. Probably the most famous America First committee member was Charles Lindbergh, who was one of the leading spokespersons. But as the war progressed and Hitler's domination of Europe became more evident, the government began to build up its defense, establishing a huge $17 billion defense budget and approving of America's first peacetime draft. As you all know, every 4 years, whether in peace or in war or in depression, an election must take place. And so in the election of 1940, FDR will run for an unprecedented third term against the Republican candidate Wendell Willkie. Willkie had been a former Democrat before switching to the Republicans in opposition to the New Deal. Both promised the same thing: neutrality in the war. FDR's campaign said, "I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." In the end, the Democrat slogan won the day: "Don't switch horses in the middle of the stream." The fear of war abroad led most voters to re-elect FDR to an unprecedented third term in office. So FDR wins the election. Letter B, the arsenal of democracy. With FDR re-elected, he will begin pushing for more aid for the Allies. Some fear that if Britain fell, the U.S. would be alone in the defense of the free world against evil. FDR declared that the Allies did not need manpower, they do need billions of dollars. And so, moving from the Neutrality Act of 1939, we see the next law being passed called the Lend-Lease Act. It allowed the U.S. to supply the Allies with war materials for anything. That's what you need to know about the Lend-Lease Act. Supply the Allies with war materials for anything. No longer did they need to provide cash. No longer did they need to provide their own transportation. In short, the U.S. was supporting the Allies. America will become known as the arsenal of democracy when it provided about $50 billion worth of military supplies to the Allied nations. Another thing that was created during this time was the formation of the Atlantic Charter. This consisted of a list of common principles between the U.S. and Britain. These principles included self-determination, freedom of the seas, and economic cooperation, which would provide a better future for the world. In other words, the Atlantic Charter, as one reporter noted, made the U.S. as unneutral as possible without actually getting into war. Hitler recognized this tendency of the U.S., and there were incidents when German submarines attacked and sank U.S. ships in the Atlantic. These attacks continued to escalate the conflict, but the push that would finally bring the U.S. into war came not from the Atlantic, but from the Pacific. That's all we're going to cover for today. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Be good, do good. Bye.